some examples of that are like adding a new feature. Like we created some new AI features that we put on. You have a trial of it on your free tier, and then if you want to keep getting this, you need to upgrade. And then the other version of that is the limit. So we previously had unlimited history of all of your meetings that you could go through, and we put a limit of it's now just 30 days on the free tier. And if you want to keep going, then you need to upgrade. So that's kind of like the first part is like looking at the two sides of the coin, I guess. And then the other side is the size of the experiment. So we call it.
Hi guys, good afternoon and welcome to the Go Design Podcast. My name is Emmanuel, and on today's episode of Go Design Podcast, I have with me Alicia. She's a Go designer at Parable. We're going to be discussing about an exciting topic that is really pertinent to any company or any startup: monetization. We're going to be talking about designing for better monetization. I will allow Alicia sort of introduce herself, tell us a little about her current role, and her experience. Hi, Alicia. Can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Alicia. I am a growth designer at Parable and have been for about 2 years now. And I'm very excited to chat about monetization and some of the fun experiments that I've been learning from.
Absolutely, absolutely. So super excited to have you also on the Go Design podcast here, Alicia. So, Alicia, can you sort of tell us a little bit about your background in terms of growth design? How did you got to land yourself as a growth designer? Did you start as a growth designer or a product designer?
Yeah, I started out with a product leaning. And so I started out really with web and marketing websites. And I got really fortunate to work on a marketing site where there was a very large product leaning. And so all the process of deciding what we worked on and the features and experiments was all very product focused. And so when it came to looking for my next role, seeing the growth role at Parable and how it was really a mix of marketing and product experiences was the perfect fit for me. And it gave me this opportunity to really find the niche that I fit in that included all the things that I love.
So, will you say, or what will you say is the difference between a growth designer and a product designer in your own perspective?
Yeah, I think there's some overlap because I think a lot of growth designers are kind of like at the base level of product designer, but then they have this approach that's very different. Actually, in the last podcast, Scott mentioned something that really stuck with me. It was about how we don't tend to be pixel perfect, and I think that's spot on because we're very experimental focused, and so you work quickly and you start really small, and so the pixels aren't as important. You're just trying to learn as much as you can, and so that's I think what the largest difference between like work product where you're working on features and you want to kind of get them right and figure them out exactly, and then growth is more speed and learning. And so the exact, button placement is an experiment and you don't have to have it completely figured out right away.
I think one of the words I took out there, or the two words I took out there was that the speed and learning. I remember Scott talking about the having that growth mindset that you are able to learn fast. So I think that's one of the really big difference because as a growth designer, what you are doing is not just pixel perfect. Yeah, we're focusing on pixel perfect, obviously, but then how fast can you learn on what you've designed? And I think it's really, really important for every good designer to have that mindset of, learning and, growth. So before we really dive deep into the conversation for today, which is about monetization, can you tell us a little bit about how you moved from good product designer to growth design? So how were you able to fit yourself into the growth designer role at Parable at the moment? Like from the interview stage, can you just share that your experience for designers out there who are looking to look for their next growth role?
Yeah, I think from the interview side and like applying for growth roles, it can be helpful to have a bit of a range of experience or things in your portfolio. So obviously, like having a bit of product work and showing that like you can and know how to work on products, but then also having a little bit of maybe the marketing side to show that like you understand that perspective a little bit, whether you're showing experiment results, because marketing leans very heavily on analytics. So if you can bring that into like a case study or an interview and be able to speak to that, I think that's really helpful for coming into a growth role. For me, there was no other growth designer at Parable when I started, so I'm still the first one so far, and so that gave me the space to really shape the role, because it was new to the whole company. And it took me a little bit of time to figure it out. And I'm so glad, Emmanuel, you have this podcast, because this is what I needed when I started to really figure out what is growth design and what does that look like. But it started out, like taking what can we do on the marketing side and what kind of experiments can we run? And then how do we bring this influence into the product team, which is, they're separate teams at the moment. And so we had to figure out how to bring the things together. And we landed on a squad format. And so I'm part of a product squad, and we have a PM that's very growth leaning as well. And so our squad mission is very focused on experimenting and monetization that we're going to talk about. Finding that kind of space where we can experiment a lot has been the way to really grow the growth role.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that story. And maybe after the conversation, I'm going to chat with you about, your experience as a first growth designer. I think that's going to be a topic to discuss for another day. Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into the conversation for today. So we want to talk about monetization, right? In your own perspective, what do you think is monetization, like product monetization? What do you think it is?
Yeah, from the product side, I think it's a cross collaborative kind of effort to convert your user base to paying customers. And so, in my experience, we've had like PMs and POs working on like the business model side of things, of like where are the areas that we can and should make money, like what kinds of things are we doing to make this a profitable business. And so they're setting the strategy, and then that comes down to designers and developers who are saying, okay, how can we use that to incentivize customers to convert to become paying users. So at Parable, a large part of this is creating value to the point where teams don't want to go back to the way things were before using Parable. So we're looking at like what are the right boundaries that we can set around the free tier so users are gaining that attachment to have a reason to upgrade. So for us, monetization is incentivizing someone to become a paying customer.
Yeah, absolutely. You said incentivizing customers to becoming a paying customer. That's when they've seen the value in the product, getting them attracted to the product and seeing the value and able to bring the money out of their purse to paying for the product. As a designer, what's the role of a designer here when it comes to monetization?
I love when designers have kind of hybrid roles, and they, like if you had a Venn diagram, a Venn diagram, I always mix those up, where you have like the diagrams with the circles that overlap. And I think that fits where a designer and a PM and maybe a developer, and you've got these overlaps. So for designer, in particularly looking at like growth and monetization, there's a very important overlap with product management. And so a designer can have a lot of influence on what are the ways that we can incentivize users, and really like working on ideation and brainstorming of what that can look like, of what kinds of levers do we have that we can like give people more value to upgrade, or what kind of limits can we put in place. And so they're working very closely with product managers to decide which things to move forward with. And then the PM might go away and look at the data, like what are the risks, and should we move forward with this strategy. But then it'll come back to the designer to then say, okay, what does this look like? How can we make this small enough to test it? And working with the developers to figure out the effort that could be involved. And then deciding also on like the user experience of that. Maybe we have something that's like a really strict limit that we want to enforce, but how can we make that feel good to a user? And I think that comes into the realm of design at that point, of like, how can we make sure that this doesn't feel bad when this happens? We want to still continue to have a good experience, even when we're asking them for money.
Yeah, I think it's about reducing the barriers for a customer in terms of design, because that's what they really interface with. Customers aren't going to interface with models, with strategies. They are going to interface with your product. So I think as a designer, it's good for us to really understand how to reduce those barriers for our customer to really convert. So let me ask this way: how do you know when a customer is ready to pay for a product or a services?
I think that that can be really challenging, and it's going to be unique to what the service is. What we do at Parable is we look at how frequently people are using the product, and we look for stickiness. So that's kind of like our main data point that we use to decide if someone has really connected with the product and they might be ready to pay. Yeah, that's probably the main thing, is like really looking at like, if you're looking at, say, like a marketing funnel of like where users are at in their flow
Mm.
from like sign up to converting to pay, there's kind of like a middle section where there's like activation and like that stickiness area of, they're using the product. In theory, we hope they're gaining some value, and hopefully you have some data points that you can look at to confirm that. And then you can try to figure out at that point in time, with, if they meet certain criteria around stickiness and those specific data points to your business, what kinds of things are going to matter to them in order to keep moving through the funnel.
I think you mentioned the stickiness. So what about, are there sort of metrics that points to you that okay, this segment of users or this segment of customers are likely to convert? Are there metrics that sort of guide you in your experience? If you can talk about those metrics,
I'm just thinking of how to put this. So with Parable, our model of how users come into the product and how they pay is it's kind of a freemium model where you sign up and it's completely free. You can have two teams that you work with on Parable, and you can invite as many people as you want to those teams. And what we've done is we don't have a hard limit so far. So, we say it's the two teams is the limit, but you can actually create as many teams as you want. And you can have as many meetings as you want. You can have as many users as you want. And so we really look at, okay, have you created more than two teams, and are you actively using those teams? So Parable's a meeting service. So are you running meetings on those teams regularly? And so we're looking at very closely the users who are using us regularly and have at least three teams. So they've exceeded the free tier. We know that they've
yeah,
exceeded the limit and they're getting some level of value out of it. So with that in mind, they likely know what the free tier is. So how can we say, hey, it's time, it's time to pay us, and
yeah.
make them feel interested. So for us, it's like, what things do we know that they love? So we have a few different meeting types like retrospectives and sprint poker, and some people say, I just love sprint poker. That's all I want. So we can look at that and use that to kind of decide, maybe you want this extra special new sprint poker feature, but that's only available on the paid tier. And that can help you convert. But the starting point is really like you've seen enough value to invite more teams and to continue using us regularly.
Awesome, awesome. So let's talk about some little bit of theories. Like, can you kind of talk about some monetization models or strategies that you have come across or you've implemented?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things that we do, and it's not necessarily specific to monetization, but helpful in monetization. And so we look at, we sometimes call it a stick and a carrot. So a stick would be like a limit, like you can no longer do this thing that you maybe could do before, and that until you get to a paid tier. And then a carrot is you can have this special thing if you upgrade to a paid tier. And so we're experimenting with those two kinds of strategies of like limits and benefits or extra value that would incentivize payment. And so some examples of that are like adding a new feature. Like we created some new AI features that we put on. You have a trial of it on your free tier. And then if you want to keep getting this, you need to upgrade. And then the other version of that is the limits. So we previously had unlimited history of all of your meetings that you could go through, and we put a limit of it's now just 30 days on the free tier. And if you want to keep going, then you need to upgrade. So that's kind of like the first part, is like looking at the two sides of the coin, I guess. And then the other side is the size of the experiment. So we call it cupcake, birthday cake, and wedding cake. Our PM found that from somewhere, so I don't have an accurate source for where that came from. The idea is with a cupcake, you're starting really small with your experiment and you're learning what you can. from that experiment. And so for us, we're looking at do people convert for one, and also do they churn? Because that's a risk, especially with when we're setting limits for people. We've seen those be fairly successful, but there's also the risk of churn, and there's only so much that we can predict of what the churn could be. And so that cupcake size experiment is really, really important to figure out, what is the risk impact of this strategy. And so that's been really important to our process at Parable.
So how have you managed some of the risks, when you try to implement some new strategies, some new models into the product? Like how have you sort of managed those risks? Can you share a little bit?
Yeah, so we work very closely with our data team, and they help us figure out, first of all, if we're doing like a limited rollout to experiment this. That's what we typically do, is we start with a small set of users who kind of fit who we think would be our target audience. And our data team helps us define who would be kind of the target for this. So for meeting history, for example, we could test that by seeing who are the people who typically like to go back and view old meetings, and we can see that in our data, and we can take a portion of those users and do a test with just them. So it's a very limited small test, and then we can see relatively like what is, for example, like the churn that comes out of that test. And we can look at, okay, after that's done, what were the results of that, to determine whether we keep this feature or limit or whatever it is. And then also look at, are there things that we can do to make this safer, because we were working very quickly and very small. So then we get to, I guess, the birthday cake version of like, how can we grow this experiment so that it becomes something that is less risky. And so it's very much working with the data team to look at what the outcomes were, but also how we can limit it to just a small segment of our users.
Yeah, absolutely. What I learned from there is that you said about working in a small segment, and the act of collaborating with your data team to really understand or identify those segments that whatsoever strategy you are trying to do really resonates with them more, and able to move very fast, like learn fast from it before we sort of push the strategy to the whole product. And I think that's really, really important. Let's talk a little bit about, common challenges that product team sort of face. For example, maybe if you can sort of relate to us in your experience as a growth designer, like you said, you were the first growth designer on the team at Parable. So what are problems or challenges that you have faced when it comes to monetization or growth in general?
I think risk, as we spoke about, is a big thing, because it's difficult to know what the risk is going to be ahead of time. It's difficult to predict that, and we're trying to I guess build a hedge around ourselves as we do the small rollouts. But we don't totally know what's going to happen when we kind of increase that size, and we hope it's going to work out, and we work on that. But there's always some unknowns in terms of what the churn rate is going to be, or if sometimes we get complaints or confusion that comes into customer support, and that's something that we need to work through. And then the other thing I would say is speed, because at Parable we're a small team, and so we're figuring out still how to continuously be running experiments. So as one finishes up, we've got another one that's either like in progress or being started on the go, and really like lining them up, because making sure they're small enough and can be implemented, but also making sure that they're running long enough for us to get usable data out of it. So like the sample size is important. So even though we want to roll out small, we still need to make sure that we can get statistically significant results from that. So it can only be so small before you really need to, actually increase the size in order to get significant learnings out of it. So that really impacts our speed that we're able to get results on our experiments, because we need to make sure that it's enough people have seen the feature or gone through a flow or done whatever to give us enough learnings from that. And that's something that we're still figuring out, that we're still learning how to improve upon. And, I imagine that'll continue to be a process for a while.
Risk and speed. Can you tell us a scenario where sort of maybe an experimentation has gone wrong, and how did you rectify it?
Yeah, well, we have an experiment that recently completed. And I wouldn't say it's necessarily gone wrong. I mean, in terms of conversions, it's gone quite well. But in terms of risk, there's still a lot of unknowns. And so we've decided to actually pause that until we can learn more, because it we knew it was going to be a riskier experiment, and rolling it out, there's still some things that we know we would want to improve on, and we don't know if that would resolve some of the risk that's happening. And so we've had to completely put that on pause until we can learn more to figure out if it would be worthwhile to continue to pursue that area.
Yeah. It's helpful. One of the things you said there was that having to know that totally experimentation does not really go wrong. It's just that probably the learnings are not, they are not enough learning. So it's not as if
Yeah.
experimentation can go wrong or can go wrong. It's just about how well are you learning from it, so that you are not wasting resources.
Yeah.
There are potencies you've sort of aligned to what are the things you want to learn from it. Are you learning it? So I think, and also if the segment you are testing, are they statistically significant for you to learn? So I think, yeah, it does really answer it, enough. So let's dive a little bit into design now. Are there specific design principles or method as a designer that you think is really you should equip yourself with when it comes to designing for growth or for monetization?
So are you asking like general like design principles that are particularly important for growth?
Yeah.
So a lot of designers will, there's kind of, there's the design process of like looking through for inspiration of like, what do other people do? What are best practices? What are common patterns that others follow? And then creating multiple variations, like often your first idea is bad, so coming up with a lot
Yeah.
of different ideas. And I think those two steps are especially important for a growth designer, because there's a lot of possibilities for how you can do any one thing, and it can help you decide in particular on the size of the experiment. So as you're going through, what often happens for me is as I'm sketching out ideas or jotting down rough notes, I come up with this like big crazy idea and I go, this would be amazing. But then as I keep going, I go, oh, actually it's just this one part of it that's going to be really good and really useful. And so I'm able to distill that down into something much smaller that I can then bring back to the team, and often like bringing in other members of the team as well in that process of like, okay, I had all these ideas. These are the ones that I'm most interested in. And then getting the feedback from, say, your developers, for example, they go, actually, this is going to create too much lag time or something. I don't know. And being able to riff on that. We found our developers are actually good designers. They have a lot of really great ideas and they improve my designs daily. And so being that collaborative early when you're in that phase of ideation is really, really important and improves the work that you're going to do. And that's true for all product design, I think. But I think it becomes especially true once you're working quickly and you're trying to learn as much as possible.
What about mindset? I think there was there was an episode where I sort of tried this question, and specifically now to talking to a growth designer, what do you think are the mindsets that has really helped you succeed at your current role as a growth designer? What are those mindsets that you learned or you've built over time?
I think there's a couple. A big one is just having some curiosity of like knowing that you don't know a lot, and being curious of what do we know about our users who do this? Do we have answers to that? How can we find answers to that? And that leans in both ways. Of you can use that curiosity to learn from your experiments, but you can also use that curiosity to learn more about other functions related to your role. So, for example, I'm learning a lot, attempting to learn a lot when I have time about data right now and how I can accurately be analyzing the data that comes in from experiments. And that's incredibly important. And so bringing in that curiosity and kind of a bit of a growth mindset into your role as well, not just how you do your role, but how can you continue to experiment in, the way that you as an individual also do your work.
You talked about two things, curiosity and active learning, which is paramountly a very, very important mindset to have as a growth designer. Also, I did like to ask this question in this way, which I sort of have asked other guests on the show, is that how do you grow as a growth designer?
That's a good question. I think I'm currently working on figuring that one out, and that's part of why I'm trying to learn about data and being able to analyze my own experiments, but also figure out how to, what's the right format for an experiment that I want to do, or how to get answers to questions I have about users while I'm in the exploration process of a design. And so I think growing as a growth designer is a lot about figuring out maybe gaps in your knowledge and where you want to push things further. But a thing I'm actually learning is how to reduce my scope in a way. I'm currently reading the book Essentialism by Greg McEwen, and it's about reducing how much you take on. So for me, when I was first starting out as a designer, I would do everything to help everybody out. And so I end up with this massive workload, and I'm working a lot and doing a lot of different things at once. And I think you hit a certain point in your career where that's no longer useful for anybody. You don't have as much focus and you're not providing as much value in the area where you're meant to be. And so I think it's a challenge and a bit of a mental shift to suddenly start saying no to more things. Really, by focusing on the area that you want to be in, you will inherently be creating more value in that area. And so that's something that I'm still learning to do, but I think is an important part of growth in any role, but especially as growth designers.
I like when you talked about identifying knowledge gap. Obviously,
Mm.
I think it's general for even a product designer, right, or any person in any tech career. You should be able to identify what you are lacking and how you can fix it. And also, one of the things you mentioned is about having the ability to focus on areas that are important. As a product designer, you could actually be focusing on so many aspects of the user experience. But, as a growth designer, you might probably, like you said, you might be working on a specific aspect of the product, which could be monetization, which could be
Mhm.
activation. So having that focus, what you need to learn to really help you bridge that gap, I think is really, really important. Yeah. So to my next question, what would be your advice or tips to any designer who has just joined a startup or a company as a growth designer, maybe as their first role as a growth designer?
Yeah, a couple of things I guess would be don't be afraid to ask questions of other roles. So particularly in the collaboration side. So if you're a first designer, it's important to create those connections and learn from what other roles are learning as well. I think I could just call it like osmosis when you're just listening to other people's processes and what they're working on, and you're picking up on the language they use and the things the questions they're asking. And it can be really helpful to understand that so that you can bring their perspectives, whether it's from learning what you've learned from them or that person themselves, into your process. I think it's really important to have that almost a support system of people with knowledge in different areas around you, so that as you're asking questions, you have the resources you need. But then related to that is also asking questions and being humble enough to ask a lot of questions. Nobody knows all the things. There's always a lot of assumptions that we're working on, and so being humble enough to say, I'm running with this assumption, but it is an assumption and we might be wrong, but let's learn about if that's right or wrong. And that being able to identify that is really important.
Great point. I think this is the second time I'm going to be, hearing the point, being humble as a designer. Sometimes, yeah, the first time I heard the word humble, I was like, how do I relate it to being a designer? But I like the way you break it down, having that, being able to be humble enough to know that you are lacking in this area and you need to ask questions. I think those are really, really great advice, for anybody starting as a good designer on a team, asking questions and being open enough to ask those questions or to accept that you don't know this, and you are free to sort of ask those questions, and having support system around you. Absolutely great. Before we sort of round up the podcast, I would like to ask some lightning questions. How do you run experiments? Like, can you talk us through your process of running an experiment from maybe when you kind of identify a problem to when the result is out and how you implement those?
Yeah, so a lot of our experiments are based around strategy. So at Parable, we work in trimesters rather than quarters, and so each trimester, our leadership team will create an update to our strategy and share it with the rest of the company, and we're all allowed to give feedback on that and ask questions to really make sure that we understand what this strategy is and what this means for us. And what we do on my squad is when that strategy is set, we then will often take some time to really like brainstorm what can we do to like push forward our goals. So we usually come up with a set of a whole bunch of ideas, and then we align those and we see to prioritize them. How aligned are they to the goals? You know, some are like directly aligned, some are a little like secondary impact, and some are like it might impact but probably not. And so those are kind of bottom of the list. So we have a priority set at that point. And then so we kind of have a bit of a sense of, you know, if we want to work on maybe 3 experiments or more in a trimester, we kind of have a priority that we can pull from. And we have a lot of autonomy. So depending on when you finish something up, like myself or a developer can like pick up one of those experiment ideas and really write up what does this look like? What does it mean? You know, what would a cupcake version be? And who is it targeting? And how can we learn from this experiment? What would it help us learn? And then working with the data team as well at that point to figure out, you know, is this something that would give us answers, and what's the right type of experiment? So like, should it be an A/B test? Should it be a limited rollout? What kind of experiment should that be before we really get into, you know, actually designing and implementing and putting the effort into that? Is like, what's the best way to approach this before we really get into the weeds with it? And so that's like it's pretty loose for the way that we work, but that's the rough idea of the process of like ideation to defining an experiment.
Actually elucidated enough for our listeners. All right, let's sort of move to the lightning questions now. And the lightning questions are just three, and just to get another perspective about you. So the first question will be, what profession will you have been, or what job will you love to do if you are not a growth designer?
Yeah, so this is a funny one because when I finished high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do and kind of fell into design. So before design, I was considering, I felt like my options were teacher or author because I was good at history and English, and those seemed like the only routes you could go. And where I live, there's a lot of teachers, so the career options weren't great for those. But I think if
Mm.
you know if design hadn't worked out, I probably would have gone the route of being a teacher, and I think I would have enjoyed it. I enjoy seeing people learn.
Yeah, I was going to say that because, as a designer, I think we are doing the same thing, practically the same thing. You're teaching, having to design some interface or an interface, users are able to do something. It's similar to what a teacher does, right? Trying to teach you
Yeah.
how to do something. As a designer, we're also walking our users through the product on how to achieve their goal. So I think you are killing the bed with different stone, however I would say it. Okay, so the other question will be, what are those three books that you recommend for any growth designer out there?
Yeah. So the first one that came to mind and I recommend a lot is called Algorithms to Live By. Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths are who wrote it. And it's not specifically about growth design, it's more about math and how our brains do math. But I think as someone who, I don't have a natural leaning towards math, it was like really fascinating and written in a way that I could understand. And so it was really interesting about how you can kind of apply a lot of data principles that we use in tech and how that actually applies to how we live our lives. So I found that really fascinating. And then I mentioned earlier that I'm currently reading Essentialism by Greg McKeown, which has been great so far in helping me learn to really create more focus in my work. And I'm seeing the results of that in my day to day, which has been fantastic. But then I think it's also important to have fun things to read, things that just like, inspire you in ways that is more about just creativity. And so I'm a big fan of fiction. There's a series, it's actually a British series. It's the Thursday Murder Club about some people in a seniors home that solve murders. And it's just really fun. And I love having those really fun reads to offset the work related reads.
Yeah, it's always good to mix those things, to mix our work with something off work, just to help us regenerate our creative juice. For me, I play games a lot, so, and I watch movies, so that's how I sort of do. I don't really, yeah, I like fictional movies, but I don't read fictional books because personally I can't imagine it in my head. Reading those, I want to see it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the last question would be, what are those top three products that you really love how they were designed and you use them daily?
Yeah. So Notion is one that we use all the time at Purple, and I love it. It does so many things. handled in a, they, with all the different kinds of blocks you can choose, you're still able to get a page that looks decent. And I think that's really impressive. And we use it, we're very transparent at Parable. And so we document a lot. And so Notion is definitely, I'm in there all the time, and it's great. Another one would be Loom. We use Loom for quick demos. We work very asynchronously, and we're fully distributed at Parable. So having Loom as a way to just do a quick demo of here's a concept that I'm working on, or the CEO, here's a financial update, or I don't know, we did a hack week recently, and so we all did little demos in Loom. It's fantastic. I love that you can speed it up. Someone who talks slow you can speed it up, or someone who talks too fast, you slow it down. And there's a lot of really great things about Loom. And then on the personal side, I love, I think it's just a Canadian app right now. It's called Wealth Simple, and they have fantastic design. It's just, I mean, it's visually beautiful, but they're taking finances and investing and making, their goal is really to make it accessible and understandable to everyone. So actually their social is really good as well, because they really break things down into a way that you can understand. And so sometimes I like going in their app just because it's so intuitive, and I like learning about the patterns that they're using. So that's another fun one.
Wait, Simple. I've heard about it because I follow a popular designer that I know worked there once, and that's Fam K. Yeah, she worked there once, and I think I checked them out, but I think it's only limited to Canada, I guess, because I've not seen it here in the
Yeah, I
UK.
think so.
Yeah, I would also add those. Add the links to the books and some of those references you've mentioned in the podcast to the show notes, so that users out there or listeners out there who wants to listen to check it out will also do it to check it out. So for some of our listeners, and if they want to reach out to you or probably ask questions about your product, or want to ask you a few questions about experimentation, about monetization, how can they reach you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best spot. I do have a website, but I don't check that email very often. So a LinkedIn message would be great. I'd love to connect with other people who want to learn about growth as well. So I'd love to learn there. If you want to try out Parable, I'm on support every once in a while. So you can always write into support and you might get me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'll put the links to it, and I'll also check out Parable. I think I've checked them out once, but I think I will sign up right now and sort of use it, maybe introduce to my team also. Yeah, thanks so much, Alicia. I really appreciate the time you've spent with us today, and also big thank you to everyone who has taken time to listen to this episode. If you found this very valuable, please do well to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on any of your favorite podcast app. Also, you can consider giving us some sort of review and leaving some comments on the podcast. See you in the next episode. Thank you.